Hello and welcome back. My name is Nathan House and I'm with the Church of Christ in Houston, California. And if you could like or subscribe to this video, that'd be great. So we're continuing in our little series on the book of Romans. And today we're going to be pushing through the remainder of Romans chapter 2. Some of the things we've already noticed, and we're going to notice again a thread that runs through, especially the beginning part of this book of Romans, is that Paul's message has this universal aspect to it, right? We see that in Romans chapter 1, verse 16, that salvation is for everybody. Let's just hop over there real quick, right? Romans chapter 1, verse 16. This is a key verse in your Bible. Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God. Speaking of the gospel, right? The gospel is the power of God for salvation to everyone. So we see this universal aspect of the salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. So Paul will use this expression, the Jew first and also to the Greek, a couple of times here. And again, it's highlighting the universal aspect of his message, right? So there's universal salvation in faith in Jesus Christ. Coming down here to chapter 2, verse 9, universal tribulation and distress for every human being, whether you're Jew or Greek, if you're doing evil, right? But if you're doing what is good, universal glory and honor to the Jew first and also to the Greek. And so again, very universal. Verse 11 kind of offers again a summary idea of this universal aspect of his message, right? Why is it universal? Because God shows no partiality. You can hop over here to a verse we're not going to get to in great detail yet today, but you come to here to chapter 3 and look at the second part of verse 22. For there is no distinction, for all have sinned. So again, there's no distinction with God between Jew or Gentile. Well, why not? Because all sin and fall short of the glory of God. And so as we go through this letter of Romans, we're going to notice this universal aspect of Paul's message, right? And we're also going to notice that Paul's going to say some very shocking statements. He's speaking primarily in chapter 2 to the Jews. In chapter 1 of Romans, he was speaking primarily to the Gentiles. Now he's speaking primarily to the Jews, to these Jewish Christians in Rome. And he's going to say some things that would have been very upsetting to Jewish people, right? To Jewish Christians, especially to those who were still trying to cling to some aspect of Judaism. Paul would say some things that were very shocking. We'll get into that in a moment. Notice this as we get into, we're going to be beginning in verse 12. Notice how this word law begins to appear over and over and over. Paul introduces at this point into his argument this aspect of law. Well, the Jews put a lot of weight and a lot of stock into the fact that God had given them the law. They boasted in the law. They bragged about the fact that God had given them the law, right? Look down here at verse 17. But if you call yourself a Jew and rely on the law and boast in God. So we see this aspect of boasting. I have no idea why that just got bigger just there. Let's back that off a bit. So there again, they boasted in the law. We're also going to see that as Paul goes, and I also want you to note this expression. They show the work of the law is written on their hearts. This would have been a shocking statement. We'll talk about it more in a minute, but he's speaking to the Gentiles. But I want you to see this aspect of something on the heart. We'll talk more about it in a moment. As you go through this, the second part of Romans 2, you're going to see he introduces another aspect of Judaism that's very important in the mind of a Jew, right? So he introduces law, then he introduces circumcision. And these two things were two very significant parts of the Jewish religion, and what was given to them, and they put a lot of weight and a lot of stock in these two things. It mattered a lot to them whether you had the law was given to you. It mattered a lot to them whether you had been circumcised. They took a lot of pride in who they were. They took a lot of pride in that they were descendants of Abraham, right? They came from Abraham. If you remember in John the Baptist's ministry at the beginning of Luke and the beginning of Mark, John the Baptist will tell them, he says, don't think so much of the fact that you're children of Abraham, right? Because again, they were such great pride in being a child of Abraham. John the Baptist says, God could raise up children of Abraham from these stones. But they put a lot of weight and a lot of stock into who they were. They're children of Abraham. They were given the law. They had circumcision. And so I want you to see these things as we go through this today. So here we are. Go back to chapter 1 here, chapter 2 here, verse 12. And what are we going to see here? What are we going to notice? That all have sinned, right? We've already talked about this, but we're going to notice it again. Paul says, for all who have sinned without the law. And I want you to pause for a second and ask the question, who doesn't have the law? Right? The Jews had the law. They were the ones who bragged about having the law. So who didn't have the law? Well, that would be the Gentiles. So Paul's going to say the Gentiles didn't have the law. And in a few minutes, he's going to mention the Gentiles not having circumcision, right? So he's going to kind of lay these ideas of laws and circumcision out as they apply to Jew and Gentile. For all who have sinned without the law will also perish without the law, and all who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law. So the first half of verse 12 is speaking to Gentiles. Second half of verse 12 is speaking to the Jews, right? All who have sinned under the law. Well, who are the ones who were under the law? The Jews. But this, so again, the Jews would have agreed with the first part of verse 12, right? All who have sinned without the law will perish without the law. They would have no problem with that. But the Jews would hear the second part of verse 12, all who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law. So they may not have liked that aspect too much, right? So the law, this thing that they held up as a great blessing, as a great honor, something they boasted in, Paul's saying you're going to be judged by that law. Well, why are you going to be judged? Because Paul continues, because it's not the hearers of the law who are righteous, right? The Jews would have put a lot of stock into the fact they were given the law. They thought that made them somehow special, elect, chosen of God. But Paul says, guys, it's not about hearing the law. It's about doing the law. It's the doers of the law who will be justified. The word justified and righteous are the same family tree, right? Justified means to be made righteous. So let me ask the question real quickly on the bottom of this. Who is it, as Paul writes this and he's continuing to unpack his argument, who is it that can keep the law? Who is it that can be justified by keeping the law? Again, hop back here real quick to chapter 3 and verse 23. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God and are justified by his grace. So who is justified by keeping the law? The answer, as Paul will see in a moment, is no one is justified by keeping the law because no one can keep it, right? All have sinned. And so again, you can kind of ask the question, does having a law make you righteous? Does having a law make you righteous? You see, the Jews were given a law. Did that make them righteous? Well, as we will see, it does not. Well, why not? Because they couldn't perfectly keep the law. And in fact, earlier in chapter 2, which we looked at last week, Paul had already told them that the very things you know you should do, right? As he's speaking to these Jews here, he says, you judge, he says, for in passing judgment on another, right? They were judging the Gentiles. He says, you condemn yourself because you, the judge, practice the very same things. You're doing the same things the Gentiles do. We know that the judgment of God rightly falls on those who practice such things. Do you suppose, O man, you who judge those who practice such things, and yet do them yourself, that you will escape the judgment of God? So they were guilty of doing the very thing that the law said they shouldn't do. They would look at the law, they would judge the Gentiles, say those Gentiles, they're going to be lost because they're immoral people. But Paul says to them, guys, you're doing the very same things they're doing. You are hearers of the law, but you're not doers. You're not able to keep the law. And so Paul will then continue here. And the point kind of is just to remind ourselves, what is the point Paul's making? That all have sinned. And he will eventually, we're not going to get to this today, but eventually the point is, guys, we're all sinners and we need something better than law, better than circumcision. Well, why? Because we couldn't keep the law. The Jews, it was never given to Gentiles. The law was given to the Jews. The Jews couldn't keep the law. The Gentiles were people without the law. He'll continue here in verse 14. So here in chapter 2, verse 14, so the Gentiles, Paul talks about what if the Gentiles reflect something of the law in their hearts? What does that mean? And so Paul will kind of introduce something that would have, again, probably been shocking to the Jews. For when the Gentiles, and again, notice this phrase, this ties us back into verse 12, who do not have the law, right? Here's verse 12, all who have sinned without the law. The Gentiles who do not have the law, what do? He says some of them, some Gentiles, by nature, this word nature, kind of an interesting idea. Maybe it means something that's innate in us, but this word can also be translated as something that's passed down. So teaching that's been passed down from generation to generation. But whatever the case, in Romans chapter 1, Paul makes it clear that the Gentiles had some knowledge of God, right? He said they knew the righteous requirements of God in chapter 1, verse 32. He said they knew God in chapter 1, verse 21. He said what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them, chapter 1, verse 19. So there are some aspects of God that should be clear. Whatever the case is, the Gentiles, some of them who were doing what the law required, right? Some of them were doing those things, right? Whether it was innate in all humans or whether it was something passed down, I don't know exactly. But Paul says they are a law to themselves. even though they do not have the law, because they were doing those things that the law said to do, right? They were keeping some of those things. So they show that there is a law written on their hearts. Maybe the Jews would have been shocked by that statement. Whoa, whoa, whoa. You're trying to tell us that the Gentiles are doing the law? It's written on their hearts? And again, we're not going to go to Jeremiah 31, but remember, Jeremiah writes of a time where there will be a new covenant that God will write on the hearts. Verse 15, let's go ahead and pick up here. The Gentiles show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, right? They show the work of the law is written on their hearts. The things that should be done or should not be done was lived out among some of the Gentiles. And so again, what is Paul saying, guys, to the Jews, writing specifically to the Jews in chapter 2? The Gentiles and you're not that different. There's not a different plan. God doesn't show partiality. There's no distinction. All have sinned. All will be saved through the salvation found in the gospel message. So Paul is showing a common denominator, a common theme that you guys, the Gentiles and Jews, are all going to be in a similar place, right? This kind of theme running through here. He then presses on and he's talking about, and I called it Jews in name only. Let's go ahead and look at this, verse 17. And so he's going to, real quickly, he's going to talk about this Jewish confidence, right? Remember I mentioned John the Baptist. He says, where John the Baptist says, don't say I'm a child of Abraham, right? This Jewish confidence, this Jewish self-confidence. Why John Baptist said, because God can raise up children of Abraham from these stones. So also in John chapter 8, we see kind of a similar dialogue with Jesus and the Pharisees. They were arguing, the Jews were going back and forth with Jesus, and they said to Jesus, we are offspring of Abraham. So they put a lot of stock and a lot of weight into who they were, right? We're Jews. We're children of Abraham. Paul says again, look at this Jewish false confidence. I'm going to call it false confidence. But you call yourself a Jew. You rely on the law. You boast in God. This list of things, right? This is a list of things that the Jews would have looked at and said, we're chosen, we're special, we're elect. He says, you rely on the law, you boast in God, you know his will, you approve what is excellent because you are instructed from the law. And if you are sure that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of children, having in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth, right? You're all of these things. You put so much weight in all of these things, this Jewish self-confidence, right? We are offspring of Abraham. That's who we are. We're children of Abraham. We have the law. We rely on the law. We boast in God. Yahweh is our God. And so here they are, this Jewish confidence, but Paul's now going to say, but you guys, you have all of those things that you boast in, but look at, this is where you're failing, right? Again, look at this. He says, you are a guide, you're an instructor, you're a teacher, but look at what Paul says. You then who teach others, do you teach yourself? While you preach against stealing, do you steal? Right? This takes us back to chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, which we looked at a minute ago. You practice the very same things you're telling them not to do. You who say one must not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law, look at this, you dishonor God. And notice this phrase, by breaking the law, because this kind of becomes a repeated thread running through here. You boast in the law, right? Here you rely on the law. You boast in God. You boast in the law. You're boasting in the law, but you dishonor God. God gave us the law. Well, you break the law, Paul says. So how good is that? Then verse 24, I think this is such an interesting, this is coming from Isaiah 52, verse 5, probably blended with a couple of other texts from the book of Ezekiel. But Paul writes, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. Well, I kind of look at it in this way, right? Those Old Testament Jews, right, living at the time of Isaiah and even before that, right? They were people given the law, given the circumcision, given all these blessings. And yet we see, you look at their history, they were falling into idolatry, falling into immorality. And I can't help but, look at this and think that maybe this was the thought process that God's dealing with, that maybe the Gentiles would look and say, if Yahweh is the God of those sinful Jews, they can keep Yahweh. Or maybe they would look and say, maybe they would say, if that's how the people of Yahweh act, I want no part of Yahweh. Right? I don't want any part of a God that's the people who claim to be from God. And so because of the behavior, by breaking the law, by the behavior of the Jews, Paul quoting Isaiah, so Isaiah obviously applied it to the Old Testament Jews. Paul's applying it to these people. The name of God is blasphemed among you, among the Gentiles, because of you. And so it begs an application for ourselves. Do we cause the name of Christ to be blasphemed? What does our behavior say? What does our conduct say? Are we ever guilty of having Christ blasphemed among the world by our conduct, by our behavior? Could it be said of us, if that's how a Christian acts, I want no part of Christ? If that's what it means to be a Christian husband, I don't want to be a Christian. If that's how they treat their enemies, I don't want to be a part of Christ. If that's how they treat their spouses, if that's how they act on Facebook, if that's how they react, if that's how they treat the opposite sex, what if anything in our lives shows Christ? Are we showing God's love? Going back to the comment of the Gentiles, right? Are we showing God's love is written on our hearts? Are we showing his law is written on our hearts? You see, they were breaking the law. They were boasting in the law, but they were breaking it. They caused the name of God to be blasphemed. Are we ever guilty of the same? The question that I think we need to answer, or at least consider. So then Paul will move on to talk about, well, what is if these guys are Jews in name only, right? Because they're dishonoring God and they're not keeping the law. They're breaking the law. They're dishonoring God. They're blaspheming God's name. So what does it mean to be a true Jew? And so Paul will now introduce this argument based off circumcision. What makes someone a true child of Abraham, right? John the Baptist, God can make children of Abraham from these stones. They said in John chapter 8 in their discussion with Jesus, we're children of Abraham. So there was this idea. So what would make someone a true child of Abraham? What makes someone something legitimate? Paul will say, for circumcision indeed is of value. So there is value in circumcision if you obey the law. Pause again. Ask the question, who can obey the law perfectly? This takes us back to Romans chapter 3 in verse 23, right? Who can keep the law perfectly? No one can. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So if you obey the law, great, circumcision is of value. But if you break the law, so again, what did we see here? Right? You're breaking the law. You're dishonoring God by breaking the law. But if you break the law, your circumcision becomes uncircumcision. Right? That external doesn't matter because you're breaking the law. You're dishonoring the one who gave you the law. You're dishonoring the one who gave you circumcision. So if a man who is uncircumcised, so again, Paul brings up this theoretical, right? Who was the group that didn't have the law? It was the Gentiles. Who is the group that didn't have circumcision? So if an uncircumcised person keeps the precepts of the law, earlier it was, what if someone doesn't have the law, right? Go back here, right? Wrong one there. Go back to this one. They show the laws written on their hearts. They don't have the law, but they're doing this law. And so here Paul says, what if a man who is uncircumcised keeps the precepts of the law? Will not his uncircumcision be regarded as circumcision? And by the way, can Gentiles keep the law perfectly? No, they cannot. But perhaps they were keeping some aspects of the law. And so I think Paul is highlighting, guys, you're not the Jews and Gentiles, you're in the same place. Verse 27, then he who is physically uncircumcised, but keeps the law, will condemn you. Wow, that would have been shocking to the Jews. This uncircumcised Gentiles who keeps the law. So again, these things were given to the Jews. Circumcision and law were the Jews. He says, they will condemn you who have the written code and circumcision, right? You have both of these things. But what is the problem? You're breaking the law. It kind of, again, begs another application. Does circumcision have value if you don't honor the one who gave you circumcision? To the Jews, if God gave you circumcision, but you're not living for God, you're not living by faith, you're not honoring God, does that circumcision have any value? So it kind of begs an application in our own lives. Is there value in prayer? Of course there is. But what if we do not honor in our life? What if we don't honor God? What if we're not honoring the one who we're praying to? Is there value in that prayer? If we are not living for the God that we are trying to talk to in our prayer life? What about baptism? Is there value in baptism? Of course there is. But what if we are not honoring the life, the death, the resurrection of the one whom we are baptized into? What if our life isn't honoring What if our life isn't honoring prayer? What if our life isn't honoring baptism because our conduct, is there value in those things? I think it at least begs the question, doesn't it? Is there value in prayer if we do not honor the one to whom we are praying? So he'll continue to talk about who are true Jews. And before we get into Romans 2, I want to hop over back to John chapter 8. We already alluded to John chapter 8, verse 33, Jesus in his discussion with the Jews. Notice again here, verse 39, they answered Jesus, Abraham is our father, right? Isn't that what John the Baptist said? Don't say Abraham is our father, right? Because it doesn't really mean anything in and of itself if you don't honor God. God can raise up stones of children of Abraham from these stones. So don't say Abraham is our father. Jesus said to them, if you were Abraham's children, you would be doing the works Abraham did. The problem is, your life doesn't look like Abraham's. You're saying he's your father, but your life doesn't look like his. Your life isn't reflecting the faith in God. In fact, Jesus will even get more offensive to the Jews and more shocking. In verse 44, he says, you are of your father, the devil. Man, that's got to be a shocking statement. And your will is to do your father's desire. So those are the words of Jesus. And you can kind of see the argument, I hope, as Paul highlights kind of another idea, right? This argument, right? For no one is a Jew who is merely one outwardly, right? Abraham is our father. No one is a Jew who is merely one outwardly, nor is circumcision outward and physical, but a Jew is one inwardly, right? Circumcision is a matter of the heart. And that should take us to Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 6 as well. So I would, on your own, go read Jeremiah 31 through 34. Go read Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 6. Look at this aspect of the heart and God's law and circumcision. Paul says here, a Jew is one inward, and circumcision is a matter of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the letter. His praise, the one who has this inward circumcision, his praise is from God. See, we want to be people that honor God, that value, that we're not guilty of blaspheming the name of God. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to fail. But God has a plan for that too, which we will see. But again, I want to kind of just ask this question as we kind of wrap up this lesson. Do we cause the name of Christ to be blasphemed in our life? Do we call him our Savior, our Lord and Savior, and then live a life where we dishonor him? Is there value in our prayers? If we're dishonoring the one to whom we're praying, or are we blaspheming Christ in our daily life? Is there value in our baptism if we're not living for Christ? Anyways, what is the major point here? The Jews and the Gentiles all sinned. They all make mistakes. The Gentiles and the Jews are both all under sin. So what is God's plan? What will it be? And Paul will continue to unpack this. And in fact, he already told them the answer way back in Romans chapter 1, verse 16, didn't he? But we're going to continue to unpack this and look at this more later. You guys have a great day. God bless.